The book that we're looking at tonight, the images that we're looking at tonight, illustrates, illuminates, and I think provides a context for a continuing examination of those events. The three people up here deserve much longer introductions than they will receive. Ed, Meek, and Curtis Wilkie were here on campus during those events. Wilkie was a student and Dr. Meek was a budding journalist. Separately, they worked. Curtis took notes and Ed took photos. Dr. Meek subsequently worked for and taught at the University of Mississippi for many years. He also pursued a variety of private enterprises quite successfully, and they led to he and his wife Becky endowing the Meek School of Journalism and New Media in 2009. Curtis graduated
barely.
And he worked in Mississippi en route to the Boston Globe, for which he was a domestic political reporter and international correspondent for most of his career. He's the author of several books, very highly celebrated books. He now teaches for the Meek School and serves as a fellow for the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics. William Forrest Winter wasn't here during the riot, right?
No, not during the riot.
Okay. But was already a veteran on the Mississippi political scene. He had been elected to the House of Representatives in 1947 while he was a student at Ole Miss in the law school. Later, he served as the state's governor, and since then, he's been a transformational leader in the areas of race and education. In the 1990s, Governor Winter served on the Presidential Commission on Race. The William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation on this campus bears his name. He received a 2008 Profile and Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library, and also close to home, there's the William F. Winter Professorship in the Department of History. So we want to thank each of you for being here. After the program, books will be available again out in the lobby. And I did visit Walmart yesterday. If I don't go once a day, they send after me. And I noticed they're putting out the Christmas decorations. So if you haven't completed your Christmas shopping list, you can do it here tonight at the Meek School. And I mention this self-servingly because at the outset of this important project, these generous gentlemen decided that all income derived from this work, and it was a lot of work, would be placed into an endowment to support the work of journalists in the days and years to come. So we thank them, and with that, I'll turn it over to Curtis.
Charlie, I don't know why you turned it over to me, because it's really Ed Meek's show. I'll just simply say that Ed and I started here as freshmen in 1958, and Ed got his PhD before I ever got my bachelor's degree. But it's fun to be in his company and my dear friend Governor Winter, and I'm just honored to be here. And I think, Ed, we're probably just ready for you to maybe start the slideshow, and we're going to comment. We can be informal. We'll make some observations, and you know, we'll be interested in hearing from Governor Winter about the historical impact this had on this university and this state, and we'll also be interested in what you have to say about your old political rival, Governor Barnett. So, you know, roll the pictures, Ed.
Well, I think it would be appropriate for me to explain that I'm from Charleston, Mississippi, Tallahatchie County, and the civil rights movement really began in Tallahatchie County with the death of Emmett Till. And I went to that trial as a youngster. And when I came to Ole Miss, I brought with me the heritage of my county. I had the same attitudes many Mississippians did, and frankly didn't realize what was going on at the time when I came. But Ole Miss changed my heart and my attitudes, and this book reflects some of that. Now, I wish I could say that I had the brilliant idea of making this book, but I didn't. Will Norton did. I've had these pictures in a lockbox for 40-something years and did not really realize the historic value they might have until Will suggested this book. And I'm most grateful that Curtis, who is a world-class author, and Governor Winter, who's been a world-class leader for Mississippi, could contribute to this book and make it what it is. We're going to look at some slides, and the first one, of course, is James Meredith. And I will say this about James. James and I have remained friends over the years, and when we first brought him back before the dedication of the statue, Robert Kayak was chancellor. I reported to him. He said, "Can you get James Meredith back here? We need to start the healing process." And so I went to my lockbox and pulled out a picture I'd made of James in the classroom by himself, sent it to him and asked him if he'd come. He said, "Sure," and I remember you making that picture. I'll tell that story later. But James surprised us all when he came to the book signing in Jackson, unsolicited. I'd sent him a note and asked him to join us. And he said, "Well, I came for one reason." He said, "You obviously have not read my letter." He had written me a letter. Of course, I sent him a book. He said, "Of the hundreds of books, and I've read them all, this is by far the best book of all. I've read it 3 times." Well, that was quite a tribute. But then I realized what James was really saying was James was locked up on the 2nd floor of Baxter Hall. He'd never seen what was going on. So it was really unique for him to get to see all the pictures. Now, Governor, your friend and mine, Governor Barnett, was the instigator of this. And from my posture as a student at the time, I didn't really understand. I should have, but I didn't. And the governor's position was one of interposition in that the states had certain rights that the federal government did not. And this would not have happened if he had not been who he was and so adamant in his position. But Governor, tell us about Governor Barnett.
Well, I don't have time to tell you everything about Governor. But in the summer of 1962, a few weeks before the event here on September the 30th, Governor Ross Barnett was probably in the low 30s in terms of public popularity. He was not a popular governor, in my opinion, had not been a successful governor. I was serving at that time as state tax collector of Mississippi, collecting the illegal black market tax and trying to keep myself out of the issues of the day. But in the summer of 1962, it was evident to all of us that we were heading toward a confrontation over the admission of James Meredith to the University of Mississippi. Several efforts had been made earlier. Medgar Evers made one earlier, and all unsuccessful, of course. And then along came James Meredith, possessed of almost a unique determination and a great deal of courage. And so he had been going through the courts up and back for several months. And finally, the court came down and said to the University of Mississippi, "You cannot keep James Meredith from enrolling as a student." They said that in so many words. Ross Barnett's reply on statewide television, now remember he was not very popular in the state, he went on statewide television after that court decision and said to the United States government, "You cannot make us take James Meredith as a student at the University of Mississippi. The people of Mississippi will not allow it, and I will not allow it." And so those of us who were looking at that television that evening got up the next morning. I got up the next morning saying, well, old Ross is, he's been a fool again. He's gonna, he knows he can't do this, and he's gonna back down. And I was really scoffing at it, and I went uptown to have a cup of coffee, and to my utter amazement, some of my fellow coffee drinkers were saying, "Wasn't that a great speech Governor Barnett made last night?" And before I knew it, and before I think I could believe that it was happening, a hysteria, literally a hysteria, spread over the state of Mississippi. And Governor Barnett called on all red-blooded Southerners who believe in the Southern cause to rally together. And if we will stick together, there's no way the United States government can enforce this order. Well, those of us, and particularly those of us who are graduates of the Ole Miss Law School, had been taught by Dean Farley that the Supreme Court is a part of the law of the land, and we are to obey that order. To my amazement, almost everyone I talked to the next day, and there were a lot of reasonable folks I talked to, said, you know, we've got to fall in behind the governor. He's our governor. We've got to fall in, and we can't let that happen up at Ole Miss. And then, of course, things began more and more tense. And I assumed that the governor had some way out. Surely we weren't going to have another civil war over this. But then, after the football game on the night before, on September the 29th, on that Saturday night, I think I understood for the first time how the first Civil War had started, how Hitler came to power in Germany. It was mass hysteria. We had, my wife and I, Lisa and I, had friends from Kentucky. We were playing the University of Kentucky. We had friends from Danville, Kentucky, spending the weekend with us. And after the game, we met them. They were sitting in a different part of the stadium. After the game, we reunited, and they were shaken. They were really shaken. And they said, we've never been so frightened in our lives. I said, what happened? So we were sitting over there with a bunch of Ole Miss people, and when Governor Barnett, when whoever it was got up and spoke, we didn't know it was the governor, whoever it was got up, and we didn't stand up. And we were threatened. We were told in no uncertain terms that unless we stood up, they would see to it that we were escorted out of the stadium. They were really threatened that night. They were afraid. That was the kind of hysteria that had enveloped the state. And I did not really believe that was possible. Although I'd seen a lot of very unfortunate incidents take place, I really thought there was going to be a resolution of the problem, short of physical confrontation. And then, of course, we know what happened. Thanks to these very dramatic photos here that you've made, and thanks to you presenting them here, we now understand what happened. If I may add one more very short paragraph to these remarks, the thing I think that disappointed me the most and dismayed me the most was the successful effort of the Citizens Council to put all of the onus, all of the burden, all of the guilt on President Kennedy and on Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And there was a calculated propaganda effort in Mississippi that was, I think, successful in raising Ross Barnett to a position of heroism and to making the Kennedys look, I campaigned for the Kennedys. I was favorable to them. I thought they were good folks. But that made them the arch enemy of the people of Mississippi. And I think that was the greatest disappointment that I felt, in addition, of course, to my disillusionment over the fact that we had this terrible event take place on the campus, on one of the most beautiful campuses in the country, a place where I had gone to school. And it was one of the low points in my life. September the 30th, 1962 was one of the low points in my life.
Well, I'm glad to hear you discuss that situation in that my memory was that I don't remember many people, faculty, students, otherwise, speaking out against Governor Barnett. And there was a vacuum. Now, obviously, Barnett was just wrong, absolutely wrong, but people were afraid, apparently, to speak out because I don't remember a lot of people talking to me about it, and I was a young reporter and should have known better. I was hitchhiking back from Charleston. That was my mode of transportation at the time. And got to Oxford, and my friend Larry Speaks. Larry worked for 3 newspapers under 3 different names, and I worked for 3 different newspapers under 3 different names. We wrote the same story 3 ways and 3 different pictures. Got paid 3 times. So we were hustling. And Larry grabbed me. He said, "Hey, the marshals are landing. Meredith is coming. The marshals are landing at the airport." So we ran out to the airport, and sure enough, there were the marshals disembarking from a plane. We got ahead of the crowd as they came to campus and took pictures of them arriving on campus, stood in front of the Lyceum, and started out as a pep rally. And we were all sitting in front of the Lyceum, hotty-toddy, and there was a guy with a bugle playing Rebel March, and it was so much fun. And the marshals, as you see, came in trucks. Surrounded the Lyceum to work, and we were just having a good time. And about that time, my memory was, I heard a whoof, 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 and a beer bottle came over my head and hit a marshal up beside the head. And as I turned around, Larry and I both were called, we turned around, we didn't recognize a single person. And you'll see pictures here of students that I made, but when the riot started, they weren't there. As Governor Winter said, the general manager of WLBT, which was the most powerful station in the state, Fred Beard, went on channel and said, basically called for people to come defend Ole Miss. Curtis?
Yeah, I was out in front of the Lyceum also. Like so many of the students, we got back to campus after the football game that Saturday night. And Governor, I corroborate what you said. I was struck by the crowded football game. I said that it was essentially like a Nazi rally and very much like what the Hitler rallies at Nuremberg must have been like. When we got back to campus, we learned that the marshals had encircled the Lyceum clearly as a show of force by the federal government. And there was a crowd of maybe 500 students in front of the Lyceum, largely curious. We thought Meredith was going to be brought there and would be registered, and we'd see history made. And as Ed said, the mood was not particularly hostile at the beginning, but as it began to get dark, it began to turn. And there were some students who were clearly provocative, were throwing things. They had tried to puncture the tires of the military trucks that had brought the marshals here, and they were incidentally being egged on by the Mississippi Highway Patrol. And finally, right at the stroke of 8 o'clock, the marshals, with no warning, fired a volley of tear gas into the crowd, and the marshals, had been provoked, and so the trouble was on, and it was quickly taken over by people who probably had never been beyond the 8th grade from Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, who had been called here not only by WLBT, but General Walker had gotten on TV and called for 10,000 men to arise and go protect Oxford and the sanctity of segregation. And so essentially all hell broke loose here on this campus at right about 8 o'clock, at the very moment that President Kennedy was beginning his speech to the nation. And the president didn't know that the trouble had broken out.
This picture, I think, reflects the conflicted nature that we all felt at the time. This is a Mississippi National Guard vehicle that brought in the marshals, and you'll see somebody's put a Ross Barnett bumper sticker on a federal vehicle, and that was the National Guard. This is a reporter. There were 360 reporters from around the world. One of my tasks was to register all the reporters. We had 360 people from all over the world, many of whom stayed well after the riots. Many were here months before. It was a massive invasion of press and interest in this. This shot, early on, James was hung in effigy outside of a dormitory. And some students did it, and we were dispatched to go take it down. I had to snap one shot right quick. Curtis?
You know, the funny thing of all these pictures that you've taken and other people have taken, I'll be damned if I can recognize a single fellow student. You know, I know they were contemporaries of ours, but I don't recognize any of them.
I recognize a couple of guys here. I don't remember the names, but I recognize these guys. These were all students, to my knowledge. This was after the fighting began. There were snipers on top of the Y building. 2 people were killed. The tear gas was so thick that Larry Speaks and I stayed there all night, but we had to lay on the ground and crawl on our bellies to stay below the tear gas, as bullets were flying everywhere. And I remember I rolled over this guy, and as I did, I looked at him, and it was a boy who I was in school with in the 1st grade in Oakland, Mississippi. His name was Toby. And I looked at him and said, Toby, what are you doing here? He had a shotgun with him. He said, we're coming here to save Ole Miss. I said, Toby, you need to get the hell out of here and go home. But that's what had happened. The Grove was just crawling with people. I didn't recognize anybody in the Grove after dark. But President Kennedy, I think, was very smart. This was a difficult situation. He set in, the Mississippi National Guard was federalized first, and they came in, and they were conflicted Mississippians, but they did their job. Then he brought in the 101st Airborne, and by morning of the next day, there were 30,000 troops that occupied Oxford, shut down Oxford, locked down the campus. There were foxholes dug all around, and you had to really look for them to find them. I remember the water tower, James was at Baxter Hall, and all of the water tower was an embankment of foxholes and people there. And I think if Kennedy hadn't done that, this would have been a massacre, my personal opinion. The next morning, you recognize Peabody, why?
The Croft Institute.
Yeah, now the Croft Institute. And they rounded up everybody that they could, and were going to put them in the pokey. And of course, the 101st Airborne didn't realize that most Mississippi good old boys had pickups and had a shotgun or a rifle in the back. So anybody who had a rifle or a gun got picked up. Well, the next morning I got the wrong position. I got picked up, and they were taking me in the line there. But one of the marshals recognized me and got me out. Now, of course, all these people were released. They just grabbed everybody to lock things down. But Larry and I went home about 3 o'clock. We lived in the village to clean up and try to get the tear gas out of our eyes, and then came back. And as I came back the morning, as the daylight arose, there was a golf course that went from where the Student Services Center is, which was the old gymnasium at the time, all the way over to Highway 6. Was a 9-hole golf course that we played all the time. Well, that golf course had Jeeps that you see here. There were 12 wide. Each had 4 to 6 soldiers on them. Some had weapons mounted, and they moved out and took over the community. And I think that probably saved Oxford in a much worse situation. Curtis, you want to comment about the next morning?
Well, the campus was still reeking with tear gas, and I'm not sure how many classes were actually held. There were literally thousands of rounds of tear gas that were fired. The campus was covered with the burnt-out canisters. If you've ever been gassed, it's not pleasant. It feels as though your lungs are being seared. One other observation I wanted to make is that it was my feeling that the Ole Miss administration totally abdicated their responsibility, and there were only a handful of people on the faculty who stood up for the decision to obey the law. I see one of them here in the audience, Gerald Walton, who was a young professor at the time. But we didn't have enough people like Gerald. The leadership of the school ran for cover. Ross Barnett, the governor, declared himself the registrar of the school and personally denied him entrance to the school. That's how topsy-turvy things became.
Chancellor J.D. Williams, who hired me at 24 when a vacancy occurred, he called me and said, I want to make you head of public information was at the time. He said, I don't think, nobody thinks you could do the job but me, don't let me down. Well, I tried hard not to. But right before Dr. Williams died, I was in his home with Ken Dean, who Jeff, you remember. And Dr. Williams told us at the time, he said, the biggest mistake, regret of my career was I left. I didn't provide leadership. And the truth is, there were stories all the time. Every time there was a confrontation, and you must know there were numerous starts and stops. Chancellor Williams would go to Florida for a business meeting or whatever. So he really abdicated his leadership, and that he was persecuted by that thought to the day he died.
You know, Governor, you talked about the hysteria and what you were taught from Dean Farley in law school. There were so many members of the legislature would have been lawyers. Did anyone stand up in any kind of position of authority in the state?
Not effectively, and certainly not with any degree of effective results. Everyone was totally intimidated. I was in politics. I was holding elective office. I was not a Barnett fan, and everybody knew that. But I must confess, I was hesitant to take on the governor at that point. It became almost a fact of life that if you wanted to get along, and especially in politics, you didn't confront Governor Barnett on this business of keeping this African American out of the University of Mississippi. We're all going to stand behind Governor Barnett. And even those who had not, many people who had not supported Barnett in the past find themselves supporting him either because of their being intimidated, as many of us were, but because they frankly felt, well, maybe if we do stick together, we won't have any integration in the state. They lost connection with reality. And I would not have thought that possible up until that time. But after that happened, I think that's when the eyes of the people, of many people in this state, began to open a little bit. And when Billy Munger was the president of the Lamar Life Insurance Company, which owned Channel WLBT, and Fred Beard was the manager, and they were the microphone for the Citizens Council, and took totally fanatical positions on integration. And on the morning after the riot, Billy Munger, on his own, chairman of the company that owned WLBT, went down to the station and demanded a microphone, and I think in a really just an impulsive, almost impulsive speech, called on the reasonable people of Mississippi to come together and denounce what had happened at Ole Miss, and come together and arrange a strategy that would enable Mississippi to make better decisions in the future. That cost him, I might add, that cost Billy Munger his job as president of Lamar Life.
And Lamar Life lost the license to WLBT, which was the largest, most powerful TV station in the state, because they violated the fairness doctrine in doing so.
There's a further coda to this. If you go a little bit further, when everyone's eyes were finally opened, in some cases several years later, to all the scheming that had been involved in Barnett's crazy deals he tried to strike with the Kennedy administration. Governor Barnett tried to win back office in 1967. Governor, you'll remember it very well, there were 5 serious candidates for governor, and Ross Barnett finished 5th in that race. He was finally totally discredited in this state.
This photograph is the next morning when James was headed to the Lyceum to register. On his right is James McShane, who was Chief U.S. Marshal sent by President Kennedy. On his left is John Doerr, who's a young Assistant Attorney General who played a major role throughout the Civil Rights era. And you'll see the MPs, the 101st Airborne, had locked the campus down. He went to the Lyceum and registered. His first class was in Bondurant, the graduate school, second floor. And you can still smell the tear gas, as Curtis mentioned once before. Every time it rained, the tear gas would bubble up again, so we endured that for quite some time. Here they are on the way to the class. This is on this end is Doerr, on the other end is McShane, of course, James in the middle. And this picture was right outside my office. We were provided, Larry Speaks and I were given offices in the Lyceum, had teletypes, wire photo transmitters, and this was right outside my office the next morning. I walked out and saw this. And I think it's probably the best picture I ever made. I had planned to be a photographer. And Larry Speaks convinced me, he said, "You'll never run out to Hill of Beans if you don't learn how to write." I didn't want to, but I finally reluctantly did with Jerry Hoare forcing me to do so. But I made this picture, and I think it's probably one of the telling pictures of the book, in that this is the 101st Airborne in charge, and these are students. At the time, we all walked through the Lyceum going to class. Now the Center of Activities moved to the Student Services Center, but that was the image the next morning. Here's James coming to register in the Lyceum. And then these are pictures that John Kennedy made it very clear, and the word came down through the Attorney General, that no one was to interrupt the academic process, and certainly no pictures of James Meredith in the classroom. Well, that was just a challenge for me as a young journalist who just couldn't imagine that happening. And because I had office in the Lyceum, I had friends on both sides. Larry and I had access inside the Lyceum and outside. And so I went with McShane and Doerr to that classroom. I put on a trench coat, had my Nikon F2 on a strap. And as James went in the classroom, I started just snapping pictures. And there are about 10 or 12 shots, and you'll see, if you see the whole series, the classroom is full. There's a shot of a professor talking to some students, and then they all started leaving. And this was the last student remaining, and then it was James all by himself. Now, I don't know why I did this, but I kept those pictures secret in my lockbox for 40 years. I don't know why in the world I did that, but it was such a big deal. For a long time, I thought I'd get in trouble, which I probably wouldn't have. But this is the picture I sent to James that sort of, I think, began our reconciliation with James. He called me when he got that picture. He said, "I remember you taking that picture." And so he came and we started the process. I might add that what did I do wrong? Somebody help. Go ahead. James, when we brought James back, Chancellor Robert Kayak had me get him here. And we had a little ceremony, I don't know what's happened, on the second floor of the Lyceum. And Gerald, you may remember this. And it was very tense. Dr. Kayak was young in his job, but he was determined to start a new course of activity. And we applauded James, and James was well known to do different things. In fact, at the anniversary, the dedication of his statue, his wife told us, "Don't let him have the microphone." You know what he's going to say. And we didn't at the time. But at this time, Robert handed him the microphone, and James was running for city council of Oxford. And sure enough, he said, "Well, Chancellor, I really appreciate this, and I'm sure you're going to write a letter to all Ole Miss alumni to vote for me tomorrow for city council." I thought Robert Carrick was going to have a heart attack right there. And what am I doing wrong? I'm going the right way? No, let's see. I'm lost. No problem.
Had to buy the book.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it's all the pictures that are there. I'm sorry. There were more pictures, supposedly. But I think what I would leave you with is this was such a state of confusion for the state of Mississippi. We really lost it, and it was because of one man, Ross Barnett. And it's pleasing me so much to hear Governor Winter say what I've been saying. I thought I was the only person that was in the fog, but I wasn't. There were a lot of us. And it just shows how leadership can move in the wrong direction and how good leadership works. And we had a terrible, terrible situation.
You know, Governor Winter is a great historian as well as a great leader. Could you just talk a little bit about the long-range impact this had on this university and our state?
Well, as I said a while ago, personally, it was a low point for me to see my university and my state appearing in the national media as being beyond redemption in terms of race, feeling that nobody in Mississippi had a reasonable attitude on race, and I did not realize fully how that understanding, that stereotype, still is a problem for us. What has happened here in the last few years under the leadership of Chancellor Kayat and Chancellor Jones, I think is overcoming that stereotype. But when I was appointed when President Clinton appointed me to the advisory board on race in 1997, to take a look at race relations in America, I learned so much about how Mississippi was still being regarded by so much of the rest of the country through the eyes of the incident of 1962. And so I invited my colleagues on that advisory board that consisted of such notables as the great African-American historian John Hope Franklin, and the head of the Nissan Corporation in America, and a former Republican governor of New Jersey, and folks like that. And that also included a wonderful African-American woman who was a preacher, a minister in New York City. I invited them to come and meet here on this campus, and they did in 1998. Had a great meeting here. But when I extended that invitation, the commission agreed to come. But this very well-educated, very sophisticated, very impressive African-American woman came up to me and she said, I really would like to come down to Ole Miss. This was 1998 now. But do you think I'll be safe there? All she knew about the University of Mississippi was that it had been the scene of this horrific riot where 2 people were killed and many injured over the admission of one African American to its student body. That's all she knew. And that's all a lot of people still know. That's the first thing they think about. Now, we're overcoming that. But this put a stigma on this university that we are still having to battle. And that's why it is so important, as far as I am concerned, that we take the lead, in this country in terms of racial reconciliation. I think we have so much that we can teach the rest of the country about race relations. And who will have a better background than we who went through this terrible experience down here in talking about how an entire people could be overwhelmed by hysteria over a racial incident. And I would like to think we are beyond that now, but I don't think we are. Let us not overemphasize how far we have come. We still have a long way to go, and we've seen a lot of incidents here in the last few months that indicate that there's a fairly thin veneer of civilized relationships there that can be overwhelmed by political demagogues and by those who have no understanding of what real civic responsibility is. And it's up to all of us to learn from this terrible experience that this university had, to see to it that nothing like that is ever possible anywhere in this country again.
Thank you.
When I was teaching, and I quit teaching many years ago, I used to use the Riot in my role in public relations. My whole career was spent trying to deal with these issues for 36 years. And as I tried to refer back to the Meredith incident for examples in class, I began to realize that many students didn't relate, didn't understand. So then I started asking on an exam questions, who was James Meredith? And there came a point when half the students didn't know who James Meredith was. And I find today that an awful lot of people, I got a call from a former student of mine who's a teacher in Jackson, and says, none of my students in Jackson know what happened. Would you come talk about the book? Well, we're seeing a generation of people who don't understand what happened, that I hope this book will help them see what happened so that, again, we don't repeat that.
And we've got time for a few questions if anybody has one.
Any comment on the medium of press in Mississippi at this time, like the newspapers in Jackson and over the state? Were they helpful in trying to delineate the truth of what was going on, or did they editorialize at that particular time?
Charles Overby, this was before you got to the Clarion Ledger. But the Clarion Ledger and the Jackson Daily News really added to the hysteria, certainly in the weeks before the riot. And they were apologists, frankly, for the resistance in the months after the riot. And as I said a while ago, put most of the onus was put by those newspapers and some others in the media for the riot. They put it on the Kennedy brothers.
There were very few newspapers, the Greenville Democrat Times, with Harding Carter being one, Hazel Brandon Smith, a small weekly, but outside of those 2 or 3, 4, that was about it. The rest were all on board.
Yeah, Ralph, it was pretty disgraceful, with the exceptions Ed mentioned. And what was funny about it, as journalists, alleged journalists, some of these papers, like the Jackson papers, would not even send reporters here. It was as though if they could ignore what was the biggest story in the world for a couple of weeks, this enormous constitutional confrontation between the state of Mississippi and the government of the United States, that it attracted, as Ed said, these hundreds of reporters from all over the world. And people in Jackson, papers didn't even bother to send anybody up here. They thought they'd ignore it and it would go away and they could inveigh against it with their racist columnists. I think those papers in Jackson were as bad as any papers that ever been published in America.
My father came in and said to me, we're no longer going to take the Clarion Ledger or the Jackson Daily News. We're going to take the Memphis Commercial Appeal because I want you to at least have some part of the truth in print. So that ended that.
The most significant journalist in Mississippi, and we called Memphis, Mississippi at the time, was an Ole Miss graduate named Bill Street. And you read Bill Street, who was a realist and a real leader in this whole controversy.
Right there. Yes, sir.
Tom Lady. I would just like to make a couple of comments and to affirm what Governor Winters said about the mass hysteria. I had just received word about 3 weeks before the riot of my appointment as an assistant U.S. attorney here in Oxford. And so when I heard that game that Saturday night, and even before that, speech, I knew that I was headed into possibly a very dangerous situation. And about a week before the riot, the U.S. Attorney, H.M. Reed, called me and told me, John, we can't handle you right now. I need for you to wait about a week. I was supposed to come in that Sunday, but he asked me to delay it for a week, which I did. And one interesting thing, and I think, Curtis, you mentioned General Walker, and many people have no idea about anything about General Walker's background or anything, but he was charged with sedition, and then a psychiatric examination was ordered on him. And I remember one incident where he and his lawyers were back in Oxford. This was maybe a couple of months, a month or so later. And H.M. Ray, the U.S. Attorney, they had come over to our office where Ajax is now. That's where we're located. And H.M. offered to let them use one of our conference rooms. And the chief attorney for General Walker was the Brigadier General Watts, Clyde Watts, out of Oklahoma City. And he said, no, it's probably bugged. And so they left. I don't know where they went. But then a few months later, General Walker was back in Oxford. I had left the office to go over to get a haircut at Park's Barbershop, which is Booley, I guess is now. And I walked in, and General Walker had just gotten into the chair, and I took the empty chair next to him, and he carried on a monologue about many different things. Particularly, he talked about Carl Rowland, who was an African-American who had just been appointed ambassador to Finland. And he was very much down on him. And so anyway, when he left, when his haircut was finished, he had his shoes shined. He got up and flipped a silver dollar to the man who had shined his shoes. He walked out, and somebody among the crowd in there said, who in the world was that? And I said, that was General Walker. And of course, a lot of commotion then among the people to the day.
I see, a lot of people are younger than we are. Just to explain, General Walker was had been cashiered as commander of U.S. forces in Europe for trying to indoctrinate his troops, and had come back, and he was a major figure with the John Birch Society, which is a far-right group. And he did show up on campus the night of the riot. He was accused by the Associated Press of leading a charge on the Lyceum. So far as I know, he didn't do that, but his presence here was clearly provocative. And I think the great description of him was Big Hiding Carter called him in an editorial a seditious psychopath, for which General Walker sued Big Hiding for that. He also sued AP, and he lost both of them.
Lady in the back. Yes, ma'am.
First, I want to thank you all for providing some clarification to the citizens of the community in regards to their partake on segregation. I know, for example, a lot of African Americans, young African Americans like myself, we automatically assume that these people did not want to segregate the University of Mississippi, but we were ill to the fact that these people had some hysteria of fear, which is why they decided to go along with ours. So I want to thank you all for that. But my question is, I wanted to know, how did this riot affect the students after the event? Could you provide some recollection of that, or how did this change the climate of the university? How did students respond after this, once noticing how the nation shunned upon this act?
Well, I'll start the conversation by saying the next morning, James was on the second floor of Baxter Hall. The kids on the third floor above him started bouncing a basketball 24 hours a day until we were discovered, and that was stopped. But Curtis, what do you think?
Well, Meredith himself was largely shunned by the student body. I had only one semester left, and I very rarely saw him. I have since told him I'm very sorry that I never invited him to have a cup of coffee or go have a meal with him to make his life a little more comfortable. I was not a profile in courage by any means during that time. I think there was a lot of anger on the campus. I know I was angry. I was angry at everybody. I was angry at Barnett. I was angry at the Kennedys because I felt everyone had failed in trying to put this together and to follow the court order. But I speak only for myself, and I was considered something of a weirdo on campus anyway.
Still is.
Let me mention the name H.M. Ray, one of the unsung heroes here as a U.S. attorney. He was one of my law class members of the legislature early on, and H.M. was a real hero. There's another name that I think we need to remember, and that's that of Duncan Gray, who was the minister at the Episcopal Church here, later Bishop of Mississippi, who got out in the middle of the mob there and talked to Joe Walker himself about.
Yeah, confronted him.
Yeah.
Let me just say, there was a period of confusion and transition for all of us. Many, many years later, Bert Case, who is very ill now, distinguished Ole Miss journalist, broadcaster in Jackson, came to homecoming, and he brought with him Jake Smith, who was a black reporter for WLBT. So Jake wanted to go, homecoming wanted to go to fraternity row. And I told Bert, I said, well, I don't know. So I come on, let's go. So we go to the Sigma New house, and there's a fence in the front, and we're standing on the fence, sitting on the road side of the fence, looking in at all the kids dancing and carrying on. And I was talking to Bert, and then I turned around and said, where's Jake? And we looked out there, and Jake was right out in the middle of the crowd with a bunch of kids, white girls. Before I knew it, the Sigma News picked him up, physically put him over the fence. We went right on. Jake showed up at the book signing in Jackson and said, do you remember the instance? So it was a long time before we came around and things began to change. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that you were temporarily detained during a riot, but you were recognized by a National Guardsman, I believe, and he let you out.
Marshall.
Talk about that. What happened to some of the other students that were taken there?
Well, they were all taken downstairs, literally, and just put sort of in a bullpen until they could be sorted out. And nobody was mistreated in any way. It's just the military police didn't know who was who, so they just grabbed everybody that didn't seem to belong somewhere. And it was really not a big deal. I'll tell this story. We had, in Jackson, had a lady show up at the book signing, and her husband was in the National Guard, Governor, and he was a senior trying to graduate, and his commander let him take off his uniform and go to class and put his uniform back on. In the meantime, he put his M1 rifle in the trunk of her car. She got stopped by the 101st Airborne and got arrested and had to get her out. So it was that kind of situation.
You know, of all the various figures, nobody's real sure exactly. We're sure 2 people were killed. No one knows how many people were wounded there. At least a couple of hundred, maybe hundreds that didn't go to the hospital. There were 200 or 300 people who were arrested. Only a handful of Ole Miss students. Only a handful of students. I believe there were almost as many students from Mississippi State as there were from Ole Miss who were actually arrested, because a lot of students from other schools came over here that weekend to, join in the fun.
Yes, sir.
Governor, you mentioned that Governor Barnett was not popular in 1962. At the time, he was governor from 60 to 64, I believe. And at the time, the governor couldn't run for consecutive term reelection. What was his motivation for the stand he took? Did he have a political motivation? Was he hoping for a shot at the Senate like Governor Bilbo had done, or?
I don't know. Barnett was, I never fully understood it. He ran as a so-called moderate. He ran for governor 3 times. The first 2 times he ran as a more moderate candidate. And then in 1959, when he was finally elected, he ran as the candidate of the Citizens Council. And so I think he became almost a prisoner of the Citizens Council. And I think he recognized as a practical politician that's where his bread was buttered, and that's how he became. And then I think he found himself in a corner that he didn't know how to get out of in the Meredith thing. I think he didn't realize how deep into the mud he was sinking. And then when he ran, as has been pointed out, in 1967, a race in which I was a candidate, that campaign started out with everyone assuming that Ross Barnett was the candidate to beat. I didn't think he was. I thought he had lost his luster in the intervening years. And I was foolish enough to think that I could beat him. And I think I could have had it been a race between him and me. But a lot of folks thought that it was going to take a super segregationist to beat Barnett. And then I did not fit that mold, and so they got John Bell Williams, who was a super segregationist, into the race. And even though I led in the first primary and Barnett ran 5th, Williams won in the second based on that strong segregationist attitude that still prevailed in 1967.
Robert?
And I know you encourage Governor Winter. Many people in the room who don't know who I am, I'm Robin Street. I think it was doing journalism. And those of you who do know me know I have to get in the word about my dad. My dad was an Ole Miss administrator then, and I've been told all my life that he was a hero that night. And he had a little green Volkswagen, and he left our home on College Hill Road and came and got Jerry Hopkins, who was a physician in town, brought him to the Lyceum, doctor, wounded, and then shuttled back and forth through the riot from the Lyceum to the hospital and saved some folks. And that night, my dad was one of the Ole Miss administrators who maybe didn't stand up, but certainly was the most powerful impact on his life, and he was never the same after witnessing life.
I reported to her dad, George Street, and that's absolutely true.
And I see his longtime assistant, Miss Patricia Huggins, right here in front of me. She doesn't know I see her.
Right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm curious as to what position the campus newspaper took.
Sidney Brower, who was editor at the time, Sidney Brower Mitchell, who lives in New Jersey, called for calm and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and the student paper played a major role in it. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. There. Keith L.
Did it ever occur to either one of you guys how big of history this whole thing would ever be? Did it ever occur to you guys why you guys take pictures or writing articles? Did it ever you guys, oh my gosh, this is going to be history, we're going to talk about this.
I don't think there's any question that it was an enormous story. I think everybody realized that the enormity of it. There's no way to avoid it with so many reporters on campus and headlines. And I know that the morning after the riot, I wrote my mother, who went to Ole Miss, and my stepfather, a 10-page letter, included in it a map of the campus and how the fire truck came up from this direction and the bulldozer from this and whatever. So I was aware that I wanted to save something for my own historical preservation, just personally. And thank God I rediscovered it 40 years later after my mother died, and I was cleaning out the house, and eureka, here's this map, and here's this fresh recollection of what went on here.
I don't think I really understood until in my career, I met all the great journalists of my lifetime. They all began in Oxford. Dan Rather was a young reporter on a Waco, Texas television station, and this was his first big story. And we brought Dan back to speak at the school graduation. I found the picture I made of him, his first telecast, and he couldn't believe it. But all of the top journalists of my generation were here. Well, that helped me do a better job because they knew me on a first-name basis, and I knew them. Go ahead. Just
right here.
Oh, sorry.
If you've grown up in Mississippi and gone to school here recently, around the 7th grade, you take a Mississippi history class, and you spend the majority of the time talking about Native American burial mounds, and this is hardly mentioned. Why do you think in Mississippi we still aren't comfortable with teaching something like this at such a critical turning point in our history?
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to enlarge that a little bit. My wife and I took a grandson, 16 years old, with a group to Vietnam several years ago. And as we landed, he ran down the jetway and said, hey, by the way, there were a bunch of young people. They said, none of us know what Vietnam is. What is it? And I couldn't imagine that an intelligent group of young people who didn't know. Well, I find today people don't know what happened. And I found out in Vietnam, for instance, that if you look at our textbooks in high school, Vietnam is a paragraph. I found out from a friend of mine in Vietnam, it's a paragraph in their textbooks too. So history, we have a way of sort of manicuring history, and I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, there's a good new history of Mississippi that it's not on junior high school level, but it's been published by Dennis Mitchell. That's quite good, and a great deal of it is devoted to our racial problems, and not only Ole Miss, but Freedom Summer, the whole period of the Civil Rights Movement. So it's not been totally ignored. History books are a hell of a lot better than the ones I was taught in the 7th grade, that disgraceful thing by the McLemores, I think their names were, where they glorified slavery and talked about how slaves were better off as slaves than living in Africa. Just total nonsense. It's truly unbelievable that we were taught what we were in the 50s. So I'm not sure what's taught in the high schools and junior high schools right now, but it's got to be an improvement on what it was. And I know this new history is quite good.
It is a good book, and for a long time, Charles Salas at Millsaps couldn't get his history book accepted for teaching in the Mississippi schools because it didn't provide the traditional story about the past.
Mississippi conflict and change. Conflict and change.
Yeah, that's it.
It's a terrific book compared to anything they allow. You'll see the difference.
One thing about student newspaper was student newspaper's been getting in trouble a long time. The Daily Mississippian started agitating for desegregation about 11 years before 1962 with an editor named Alvin Krebs. You remember that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I could listen to William Winter and Curtis Wilkie and Ed Meek all night. So we just want to thank you guys and give you a round of applause.